As the harsh winter wind swept through the Appalachian Mountains on Christmas Eve 1945, a devastating inferno consumed a two-story timber frame home in Fayetteville, West Virginia. By dawn, the residence was nothing but a smoldering basement of ash and twisted metal. 4 children and their parents had narrowly escaped the blaze, shivering in the freezing dark. But 5 other children, who had been sleeping in the upstairs bedrooms, were nowhere to be found. Did Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty perish in the flames, or did someone use the chaos of the fire to steal them away into the night? This haunting question forms the core of one of the most perplexing missing children cold cases in American history. The disappearance of the Sodder children defies simple explanation, trapped in a void between a tragic accident and a sinister, orchestrated abduction. When a family is shattered on a holiday meant for joy, the psychological scars run deep. Yet when the physical evidence contradicts the official narrative, grief transforms into a desperate, lifelong crusade for the truth. George and Jenny Sodder were respected figures in their tight-knit mining community. An Italian immigrant who had built a successful trucking company from the ground up, George was known for his strong opinions and fierce work ethic. Together, he and Jenny raised 10 children in their comfortable house, creating a vibrant, bustling household that seemed insulated from the darker currents of the world outside. Only one son was away serving in the military, leaving 9 children at home on that fateful holiday. The sequence of events leading to the disaster began with unsettling anomalies. Shortly after midnight, the telephone rang. Jenny answered, hearing a woman's voice asking for a name she did not recognize, accompanied by the sound of clinking glasses and raucous laughter in the background. Brushing it off as a wrong number, she returned to bed, only to be awakened half an hour later by a sharp, heavy thud on the roof, followed by a rolling noise. She listened in the dark, but when silence returned, she drifted back to sleep. Her final awakening came at 1:30 in the morning, this time to the unmistakable smell of smoke. Jenny rushed to the hallway to find George's office engulfed in flames, the fire rapidly spreading toward the wooden staircase that served as the only path to the upstairs bedrooms. She screamed for her husband and the children sleeping on the ground floor. George, Jenny, and 4 children fled into the freezing night yard, desperately calling up to the second-story windows, expecting to see the remaining 5 children looking back at them. What followed was a cascade of catastrophic failures that hindered any rescue attempt. George raced to find his tall painter's ladder, always kept resting against the side of the house, but it had vanished. He then tried to start both of his coal trucks to pull them beneath the windows and climb up, but the engines, which had worked perfectly the day before, refused to turn over. Even the water barrels meant for emergencies were frozen solid. The family could only watch in helpless horror as the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks within 45 minutes. The official response was agonizingly slow and frustratingly brief. Despite the fire department being located just 2.5 miles away, the crew did not arrive until 8 o'clock the next morning, long after the embers had cooled. Fire Chief F.J. Morris conducted a cursory 2-hour sweep of the ashes. Without calling in forensic specialists, he concluded that the fire was caused by faulty wiring and that the 5 children had been entirely cremated by the intense heat. Based solely on this brief inspection, the local coroner issued 5 death certificates, officially closing the book on Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. The community mourned, assuming the children had succumbed to smoke inhalation before the roof caved in. However, the official ruling of an accidental fire death sat uneasily with the surviving family members, who began to notice glaring inconsistencies in the debris left behind. The primary point of contention was the absolute lack of human remains. In forensic science, the concept of a cremation threshold refers to the specific temperature and duration required to completely incinerate human bone, typically requiring temperatures exceeding 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit for over 2 hours. A residential timber fire burning in the open air for less than an hour simply cannot generate the sustained, concentrated heat necessary to reduce 5 bodies to untraceable ash. Household appliances were melted yet recognizable, meaning human bones should have easily survived the blaze. Beyond the scientific impossibilities of the cremation theory, physical evidence of sabotage began to emerge from the ruins. A telephone repairman discovered that the home's phone line had not burned through, but had been deliberately severed at the top of the pole, 14 feet in the air. Days later, George found his missing ladder discarded in a steep embankment nearly 75 feet from the house. These were not the hallmarks of an accidental electrical fire. They indicated a calculated modus operandi, a distinct pattern of deliberate actions meant to isolate the family and ensure the house burned unchecked. Retracing their steps in the months prior, the parents recalled several disturbing encounters that now felt like sinister premonitions. An aggressive life insurance salesman, after being turned away by George, had pointed a finger at the house and declared it would go up in smoke, specifically citing George's outspoken criticism of the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. While political tensions ran high in immigrant communities during the 1940s, such a specific violent threat took on a terrifying new context in the wake of the tragedy. Furthermore, older Sodder children recalled seeing strange men parked along the highway, quietly observing the younger siblings as they walked home from school. This surveillance, combined with the cut phone lines and disabled trucks, suggested a coordinated effort. The theory began to crystallize. The fire was not meant to kill the children, but to serve as a chaotic diversion while they were quietly extracted from the home, perhaps by members of an organized syndicate seeking extortion or political retaliation. Driven by the agonizing conviction that their children were still alive, George and Jenny transformed their grief into a relentless investigative pursuit. They refused to wear mourning clothes and rejected the finality of the death certificates. The Sodders transformed from devastated victims into amateur detectives, traveling across the country to chase down every lead, every whisper, and every reported sighting of their missing sons and daughters. To keep the public's attention on the case, they erected a massive billboard on Route 16 right at the site of the former home. It featured the faces of the 5 missing children alongside a detailed summary of the suspicious circumstances and a substantial cash reward. For decades, this towering sign stood as a haunting landmark for travelers, a monument to a family's enduring refusal to let their loved ones fade into the shadows of a forgotten, cold case. The billboard generated hundreds of tips, some of which seemed highly credible. A woman operating a tourist court in Charleston, just 50 miles away, claimed to have served breakfast to the children on Christmas morning, noting they were accompanied by 2 men and 2 women of Italian descent who refused to let the children speak. Another witness reported seeing the children looking out of a passing car window while the fire was still raging in Fayetteville. Desperate for federal assistance, the family wrote directly to J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. Hoover personally replied, stating that the Bureau was willing to assist, but their involvement required the permission of the local authorities. In a baffling display of jurisdictional protectionism, the Fayetteville police and fire departments explicitly declined the FBI's offer, ensuring the federal agency could never formally open an investigation into the kidnapping theory. Undeterred by the local stonewalling, George hired a private pathologist in 1949 to conduct a thorough excavation of the basement dirt. The dig uncovered several small bone fragments and internal organs. However, a laboratory analysis determined the bones belonged to an individual much older than any of the missing children, and they showed no signs of fire damage. It was later theorized that the bones had been scooped up with the dirt George used to fill the basement shortly after the fire, adding a bizarre twist of contamination to the crime scene. The investigation was further complicated by false confessions and strange admissions. A local man eventually admitted to stealing a block and tackle from the property on the night of the fire. He confessed to climbing the pole and cutting the wire, claiming he thought he was severing the power line to cover his theft, not the telephone line. While this explained one anomaly, it did not account for the missing ladder, the disabled trucks, or the utter lack of remains. According to the family's hired private investigator, C.C. Tinsley, even more disturbing behavior was unearthed from the local officials. Tinsley discovered that Fire Chief Morris had secretly buried a box at the fire site shortly after the tragedy. When confronted, Morris admitted to burying a piece of fresh beef liver, hoping the family would find it, mistake it for human remains, and finally accept that the children had died. This grotesque manipulation shattered whatever fragile trust remained between the family and law enforcement. The wall of silence and incompetence surrounding the local investigation forced the family to rely entirely on their own resources. The lack of a proper, immediate crime scene quarantine meant that crucial early evidence was forever lost to the elements and the bulldozer. The mystery was no longer just about a fire. It was about navigating a labyrinth of institutional failure where the people tasked with finding the truth seemed actively invested in burying it. The most agonizing development arrived over 2 decades later in 1968. Jenny received an envelope postmarked from Central City, Kentucky, containing a photograph of a young man in his late 20s. On the back, a cryptic handwritten message read, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, at Lil Boys, A9032 or 35. The young man in the photo bore a striking, undeniable resemblance to their missing son, Louis, right down to the shape of his eyes and his dark, curly hair. For a moment, the heavy burden of ambiguous loss, a psychological term describing the trauma of a disappearance without closure, seemed as though it might lift. George immediately hired another private detective and sent him to Kentucky to locate the man in the photograph. But the detective vanished, never reporting back to the family, and subsequent efforts to trace the origin of the letter yielded absolutely nothing. The photograph became just another cruel mirage in a desert of unanswered questions. Time, the ultimate adversary in any cold case, eventually claimed the parents. George passed away in 1969, his heart giving out after a lifetime of relentless searching. Jenny continued the vigil for another 20 years, wearing black every day until her death in 1989. She maintained a meticulously manicured garden over the exact footprint of the destroyed house, a living memorial to the children she believed were stolen from her arms. The surviving Sodder siblings, particularly Sylvia, who was just a toddler on the night of the fire, carried the torch forward into the 21st century. Their family's tragedy fundamentally shifted the cultural understanding of missing persons cases, demonstrating the profound necessity of preserving crime scenes and the dangers of prematurely closing investigations without definitive forensic proof. The billboard may have finally been taken down, but the legacy of their fight remains etched into the annals of true crime history. To this day, the fate of the 5 Sodder children remains entirely unresolved. The ashes of that Fayetteville home yielded no bodies, and the decades of searching yielded no reunions. Whether they perished in a blaze that defied the laws of physics or were spirited away into a life detached from their own names, the truth remains locked in the silent, frozen darkness of Christmas Eve, 1945. The case stands as a chilling testament to the endurance of hope and the terrifying reality that sometimes people simply vanish into the smoke.